we're going to run this as a workshop. So what we'll have you do is I'll go across my screen, and if you'll just give your name, your pronouns, and a real short synopsis of kind of the issue you want to work on in your story. We'll go in groups of 3. So we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll go to the next 3, and so on and so forth. And that should get everybody in without getting me to mix up everybody's questions, which unfortunately is possible. And if you see me lean off screen, it's because I have a stack of my favorite reference books right beside me. So I will be leaning over to grab things occasionally. Finding your setup for working from home is always fun. Dawn, would you mind being the sacrificial lamb? Because you're the first person I can see on my screen.
There we go. Yeah, I was going to say that's the penalty for having my video on, right?
Yep.
Okay, am I talking now? Yes. Am I just introducing myself, or?
Go ahead and introduce yourself and you name your pronouns. And
Okay.
then if you have a specific thing that you want to talk about that you came to the workshop for, great.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, just tell us what you're interested in getting out of this workshop.
Okay. Well, I'm Dawn Schulden-Fry, she, her, and I write a lot of fantasy, contemporary fantasy mostly at the moment. And so I will work in some things about herbs and stuff like that. So I don't have a very specific question right now, but in general, I would like to improve my knowledge of things using plants as medicines or just less common teas, things like that. Or even if there's anything about like plants and folklore, whether or not it's actually stuff you'd want to eat these days.
Sure. And yeah, I'd love to hear. I'm just going to start with the questions, and I want to hear kind of what people are looking for, and then I'll kind of introduce my skill set once we've got a starting point. Let's see, Valerie, are you able to comment?
Yes.
Awesome.
So, my skeleton. Yes, my name is Valerie Michaels. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm just here as kind of a general point of interest, but I'm working in a solar system that has many planets of varying distance from a star, but must be human habitable in some way. And so I was kind of interested in thinking about the kinds of plant life that might come in planets that are further away from what we traditionally think of as a habitable zone, but still human habitable.
Ooh,
So just like different amounts of light, you know?
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really cool.
So yeah.
Awesome. Ramona, I think you're the next person.
This is Marissa. She's my ghost.
That's awesome.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ramona was my dress form, so I thought you were still talking to me. Okay, sorry.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Ramona's the next name who didn't say specifically that they weren't interested in commenting. So Ramona, if you want to tell us about what you're up to.
I have a couple of different works in progress. I also wrote a series a while ago that was post-apocalyptic, so I had to do some research on what plants might survive in my area. I'm in Colorado. We have a little bit of a tougher climate than some areas.
Me too.
Awesome. So that's kind of where this is at, because I write fantasy mostly, or paranormal, urban sort of stuff. And you really need to know what grows where. What can people eat?
Yes, you do.
And
thank you for knowing that.
And so that's where I'm at.
Awesome. So that's a good starting point for kind of who's in, and I'm gonna check in with everybody else as we go. I just want to make sure it's not a huge round robin of everybody naming themselves off before and all getting confused with each other. So let me introduce myself and kind of let you know what I can help with. I'm Olivia Wylie. I own a small landscaping business here in Colorado. I focus on native plants. Under my own name, I write books of nonfiction ethnobotany, which is the intersection between the stories people tell and the ways plants grow. So the history of how humans have interacted with plants and the stories they've told about them. And under my pen name, O.E. Tierman, I write A Climate Changed Colorado, where genetic manipulation is possible. So they have lots of plants that have been redesigned to live in conditions that are very hard. So say an amaranth crop that can handle 120 degrees without water, or getting the genes for water absorption from creosote into roses so that roses can handle high country heat, that kind of situation. And so that's what I can help with. I was raised by an herbalist, so I can tell you a lot about the basic household maintenance of herbs and how to use them sensibly. And I decided to run this for two reasons. One is throwing certain books that I will not name across the room because of bad examples of misunderstanding plants. The particular thing that comes to mind is a book I read some years ago where somebody a witch put 10 leaves of belladonna into a dream tea. And my response was, the only thing you're dreaming about is the pearly gates because you're dead. And so I thought it would be useful to have a more in-depth discussion about how do you write green stuff in a way that doesn't make people throw the book across the room. So let's see, I think, Janet, you're the next person who's up, and I'll do the next three and then I'll start answering questions. Oh, Kristen, awesome. Oh, and thank you for everybody who put their stuff in the chats. And I apologize if I'm new to doing workshops on Zoom, so I do apologize for the confusion. Jessica's working on, wow, 4 works in progress, and healing in a fantasy world. So lots about herbs. And oh, hi, Kristen. And okay, so we're definitely focusing on herbalism. So let's dig into herbalism first, and then I really want to come back to Ramona's fascinating question about how plants would look in worlds that don't have the same UV index as ours. So the best place to start on herbalism is some of these old books, like Back to Basics is a great one. This is a book from the 70s, crafting culture. It was a Reader's Digest book on how to homestead and how to live off the land. And it has whole chapters on what do you do if you can't get to the doctor in time. And it's really valuable. It also has a whole chapter on what plants to look for to tell you you've got different amounts of water in the area, which I find truly one of the biggest treasures I've got in my library. Yes, it's very 70s, it's very of its time. You can see it's very dense, and the pictures are not what we would use today, but they're very useful. And so, for example, it's got a piece on what do you use to clean out a wound, and it's yarrow boiled up in salt water, and that's the first thing you use. And then you have to get more serious, and it talks about how to brew a tincture of whatever tannic bark you have in the area. Pine bark is particularly good for cleaning out a wound. You boil it down in alcohol until it becomes something close to a tincture. It's not a traditional tincture because you're not putting it through all the processes. But if you're in the backwoods or if you're in the Middle Ages, you get oak bark or you get pine bark. Or sometimes people would use rowan bark, but honestly, I think that's because of the vitamin C and the magical aspects mixed together. So they knew this plant was powerful, but they didn't always apply it well. I would recommend oak bark first, then pine, then anything that dries out the skin has tannic acid in it, usually. So you want to go for those, boil them in alcohol. Just boil it at a low heat because alcohol explodes if you overboil it. And that would make new wounds that you don't want to treat. So those are kind my video is bouncing a bit. I just read that in the chat. Sorry about that. I'm sitting at my little writing desk and I'm not sure if I can change that, but I can try real quick. And the question that I just got in the chat was, can I give the name of the book again? Yes, it's Reader's Digest Back to Basics, How to Learn and Enjoy Traditional American Skills. Another great book on this subject is, I've got two more, and weirdly enough, the Reader's Digest books are some of the best. So Rodale's Illustrated Encyclopedia of Herbs. To tell you how good this book is, this is my copy. I've had it since high school. The pages, no, I've had it since middle school. All the pages come out. They've been glued in a number of times. And the spine is completely cracked. That's how often I have used this book. But it's very valuable. It talks about exactly how you brew everything, how you make everything. My other recommendation is Penelope Odie's books on herbalism, O-D-Y. She is very much of a true kitchen scientist. She tells you what cheesecloth is best for using herbs to, when you're making, say, a salve, instead of having to fish little bits of herbs out of your salve, you can put it through a cheesecloth, squeeze it out, and it comes out clean. Much nicer. But for the purposes of the kind of fantasy or medieval mixing of magic and early science and observed truth, I would recommend Rodale's because it mixes those things and says, this is what was observed, this is how, and this is why it was useful. The other one I will recommend is Magic and Medicine of Plants. It's another Reader's Digest. Like I said, they were particularly good. And this is another one where if you're doing fantasy work, this tells you a lot about how stories got started about different plants. So it's a really valuable one for understanding how people make connections. And that's a great thing to take on into your own storytelling. So let's jump from the fantasy to the sci-fi and get to Ramona's question. What would plants look like in a different UV index? Well, plants use chlorophyll here in the world because the green absorbs the best wavelengths of light, the most, for want of a better term, energy dense. And the only one that they're leaving out is green, which is right in the middle, which neither has the long wavelength energy nor the short wavelength energy, which is higher power, but can also burn a plant. Now you see a lot of variation in plants. In Colorado, where I live and where Ramona lives, we have a lot of plants that have a reddish tint to them, and that is a sunscreen, actually. So they're pushing away the brighter blue hues. and absorbing the deeper tones, the reds. And that is allowing them to keep out essentially the really high-powered killer UV light and the blue light that can destroy them. All of our roses tend to end up with a very red tint to them. And one visiting friend actually asked me, "Are your roses sick?" I said, "No, they do that here in Colorado. It's the only thing they can do as a survival trick." The best thing to remember with plants is plants can't run away. That seems obvious, but it tells you a lot about why they do what they do. Because plants can't run away, they have amazing numbers of genes that can express. So to answer the question about what would a plant look like if it was in a place with lower light index, the leaves would be much bigger and they'd be much darker. They might even be using carotenoids that are closer to black because they're trying to absorb every wavelength they possibly can. A lot of the plants in the real world that live in shady spots have very big, very dark leaves. Think hostas, if you know that plant. If you're a gardener, you'll know that plant. I am looking for a specific picture in this book, which is why I'm looking away from the screen. There are certain plants that grow in shady spots that have huge, very dark leaves. And that is generally the truth of bigger plants. The more light they get, the lighter their leaves get, and the fuzzier their leaves get, and the thinner their leaves get, because they're trying to cut down on the amount of surface area they have. So it goes the opposite when you're trying to handle hot or low light. So here's a good picture of a plant called Queen's Light. You can see that plant started as a plant that lived out in the open, and over time its area got colonized and turned more and more into a woodland. And so it didn't change the shape of its leaves, but it changed the surface area of its leaves, and it changed the color. So you'll find Queen's Delight that's much thinner and more lanceolate, more strap-like in open areas. And then the deeper in the woods it goes, the wider the leaves get. And that is the best thing you're going to get. I would look into the carotenoids that turn some of the maples a very deep purple black. Those are probably the colors you're going to want to use. So let's see, Janet, you're next up. And if you'll just tell us a little bit about your work and introduce yourself with your pronouns. Okay, let's try Jessica and Janet. If you're not able to, we'll get back to you. Okay, I just read you're listening, and that's not a problem. So let's see, Jessica, do you want to go? All right. So Olivia Helling, do you want to turn? Oh, I'm sorry, Jessica, my bad. This is, okay, let's see, did Lila write hers above? Let's see. Lila, do you want to turn? All right, how about Alex? All right, Carly? Okay, so if folks want to come back around, they're welcome to. For now, I'm going to open the floor up to anybody who's got questions. So feel free to sign in and ask questions verbally, or I'm looking at the chat. So let's dive deep into stuff. I am not going to be running the show today. I really wanted this to be a workshop so you guys can ask questions. And I can also tell you about examples that were great in writing and examples that made me bang my head on the wall, if that's useful. So Dawn is asking, when you mentioned that leaves would be fuzzier sometimes, what would the purpose of that be biologically? There's two things that fuzzy leaf does. The fuzzy leaf, first of all, that the hairs protect from UV radiation. They're essentially a mechanism. It's kind of like fur on an animal. They're a mechanism to cut down the amount of direct sun on the skin of the plant. The second thing is they make it really, really unpleasant to eat. And the third thing is it prevents water from sitting on a leaf and essentially causing it to rot. This shows up in plants like mullein, in plants like African violet. It's a wicking mechanism. Now, if you have ever owned an African violet, you'll know that if you get water on the leaves and it sits there, the leaf gets a hole in the middle that is essentially necrotic, and it slowly dies. The same thing will happen with mullein, and mullein is a biennial from the European Mediterranean region that colonized everywhere else. It's got very big, very soft leaves. Sometimes it's called blanket plant or old man's blanket. And those hairs are basically to keep that constant European moisture that it had to deal with once it moved out of the Mediterranean off its leaves. So it's a really neat trick. Okay, Kristen, I'm gonna scroll up, or if you want to repost your question down here, that would be great. Oh, here it is. I got it. Okay. So Kristen had two questions. One, if one character has been relatively used to spending time on his own in the woods or mountains, what sorts of things would he know and be able to forage and bring home? Oh, that's a great question. So it depends on the region of the Northeast or Northwest America or Europe. But as a general rule, you'd be looking at cattail roots for starch and protein. You'd be looking at a lot of wild greens. You'd be looking at probably bird eggs, but that's not a plant. For that kind of thing, there's a great book. I'm going to get up real quick and I'm going to grab it for you. So the other thing anybody who lives in northwestern woods would know is acorns. You can turn them into flour, you can turn them into porridge, you can turn them into all kinds of things. The trick he would have to know is you soak them in a running stream in either a birch bark bag or a skin that you don't mind throwing out or something like that overnight, because they're full of tannic acid that's pretty awful if you don't leach it out. If he has a home, then you'd be boiling those in a pot for a number of hours. Although I grew up doing this, frankly, the best thing to do is stick them in a mesh bag and stick them in a stream with a stick pound it into the bank overnight. Don't do extra work. Let the stream do the work. The only problem is you sometimes have to fish out a tadpole, but meh, it's doable. Cattails are particularly wonderful. They're a real delicacy. You need to wrap them in some leaves, otherwise they dry out and it's like eating stale potatoes. But if you wrap them up nicely in dock leaves, are my favorite, then they boil up nicely in their own juices. So for foraging, I recommend a book called A City Herbal by Media Silverman. Yes, it says city on it, but this is common herbs that show up everywhere that are edible. And I really recommend that one. I'll go back to Magic and Medicine of Plants, which has a lot of recommendations for how to eat. And there are tons of really good blogs on that kind of thing. Let's see. The other question you asked was, what would be surprising or confusing for a character who hasn't done that very much? Well, I'd say first, you can't eat acorns raw. Second, more than a handful of apples from wild apple trees makes you really sick to your stomach. Thirdly, I would say, let's see. It gets a lot colder at night than you think it's going to. So anybody who's like, I'll just camp out, is going to hate themselves. I would say that watching somebody grub around in the dirt or in the mud, wading up to their knees in cattail roots is going to look really weird until you realize that's dinner, which is pretty funny. Because somebody's always like, why are you playing in the mud? Because I want dinner. That could be a lot of fun. It really depends on your area, what is going to be particularly interesting. So I come from Upper Wisconsin, and there were lots of comments when the Europeans met the Menominee. So I'm Irish Menominee, and when the European settlers met the Menominee tribe of Upper Wisconsin, they were really puzzled. They're like, these people, they go out on the water and play all day in their canoes. What they were doing was harvesting wild rice. So you can draw a lot of inferences from those kinds of interactions. Wild rice in the upper Midwest is a staple crop. The other thing that might surprise and might be interesting if you want to play with the true North, like think Michigan. What kept the tribes alive up there through most of the winter was maple syrup that had been boiled down into rock cakes. And then you would shave off slivers and add it to wild rice and boil it all up. And that had enough calories and vitamins in it to keep you alive through a Wisconsin or Michigan winter. And if you've ever been in a Michigan winter, you know exactly how impressive that is. The only other thing you had to add to that mix was you did have to add usually some birch bark to get all of your vitamins. And cattail roots were usually used to starch things up. So it might be surprising to someone who's never seen this terrible, heavy northern woods. How would you survive here? And of course, the person who's native has lived there a long time is just going, oh yeah, you just go over here, you get sap, you boil it up, you go over here, you get rice, you're fine. I would say the only other surprise is porcupines don't back down for anybody from anything. Do not try it. If they're climbing the tree you want, find another tree because you're going to regret it. Jessica just asked, if my healer main character is going on a journey, what herbs would be essential that she'd pack? It's a fantasy and she's stealing it from the head healer's storage. That is a great question. So first, I would go for meal from one of the starchier herbs. So you would want to steal something like cattail powder or acorn powder. Acorns, if it's the middle of spring, because they won't come crop until the middle of fall. And that is an easy to pack, easy to carry source of sustenance until you find something else. The next thing I would definitely pack is witch hazel, because witch hazel is the best thing in the world for cleaning out injuries, making sure they don't get infected. And you need the inner bark of the young trees, so you can only harvest it at one specific time of the year. The third thing I would pack if it's not in season, this is really seasonal dependent. Oh, thanks, Angel. Sorry, Alex, I will scroll up in just a second. A third thing I would pack is yarrow, because that, if it's turned into a compress, stops bleeding much faster. And the fourth thing I would pack is slippery elm bark. Why? Because it takes a long time to prepare. It takes a lot of work, and it can help. It's essentially nature's Gatorade. It helps you absorb electrolytes faster. And if you've got a sore throat, it'll keep you going. So these are not, you're not going to be living in the lap of luxury, but you've got basic food, basic way to keep your wounds clean, basic way to stop your bleeding, and basic keep you going juice. Those are the first four that I would go for. Oh, and if it's available, grab rose hips and rowan berries, because those are full of vitamin C and vitamin E and a bunch of other stuff you need. And they taste sweet. So when you're feeling crap and your body just wants sugars, you can get them down. And they need to be harvested at a very specific time. So one of the tropes that, I'm going to go on a slight tangent, and I apologize, but I think this might be useful for you folks. As someone who's lived in the deep woods, and as someone who likes fantasy a lot, but likes to poke fun at it, one of the things that's always bugged me is, I'm going on a journey, and somebody just throws a little tiny haversack over their shoulder and wanders out. My response to that is, honey, you're dead. Because yes, nature provides, but nature provides at specific times in specific ways. So if it's the middle of autumn, it's the middle of September, go for it. Just wander off with your little haversack. If it's March, you better pack a lot more than that. Otherwise, you're eating dandelion greens and poplar bark and hating yourself every step of the way. And that's if you have poplar trees in that area, which you might not. So Alex, I'm going to scroll back up to your question, and I do apologize. That's what happens when I get to talking too fast. So Alex says, I have a work in progress with ghost plants that a benevolent ghost used in life to try to keep less benevolent ghosts away. Ooh, I love it. If you have insights into which plants someone might use for that in Michigan, yes, I do. If anyone does put it in a question in the meantime, I will reread after I finish. But yes, let's see. First of all, and so I come from a background that is mixed European paganism and Menominee religion. So that's my point of view. So that's where I'm drawing information from. Depends on the culture that your character comes from. But in terms of general European know-how, the first plant would be mugwort. The second plant would be rowan. And rowan trees grow really well in Michigan. Let's see. For that kind of thing, I recommend A.J. Drew has a wonderful book called A Wiccan Formulary and Herbal. I do like this one for just what keeps ghosts at bay. What does this? What does that? Another really good one, depending on the culture you're looking for, is West Country Wicca. And I apologize, I don't know the author for that one off the top of my head. Okay then. And let's see. So yeah, those would be my first go-tos. If it's really nasty spirits, hawthorn. And you would put hawthorn thorns pointing outwards towards the danger around an area. And that is, let me put it this way, rowan and salt is keep out, please leave me alone. Hawthorn is screw off. That's kind of the difference in tone. So let's see. Don put in, I had a husky as a kid. He tried 3 times to get apart and failed every time. Yeah. So a little bit of funny backwoods information. In Menominee lore, a lot of people make, the lion is the king of the jungle for that part of the world. Well, for the Menominee, it's not bear, it's porcupine who is the bravest of all creatures. Porcupine doesn't give a crap. Leave porcupines alone. And also, while we're talking about just building woodlands, one of the first rules you learn living in the woods is, and this should be obvious, but I see a lot of people mess it up, don't put your hand in a hollow log, don't put your hand in a hole. I don't care what you think might be in there. Poke it with a stick first, if you must. Because anything from a copperhead to a porcupine can be in there, and none of it will like you. So don't. It's embarrassing when a human does it, because you should know better. Let's see. Oh, one of the things you can bump into is there are a lot of plants that look alike. So I'm going to get up one more time, and I promise I will stop doing this, to get one more great book. So I want to recommend the Peterson Field Guide to Edible Wild Plants. So this is an older edition. I'm in my 30s and I got this when I was 10. So it is an older edition, but this is a great book for knowing what your area might be harvesting depending on your area. And this is also a great book for making a point that I want you to know. There are plants, especially the ones in the carrot family, that look very much alike. But if you mix them up, you're not eating a wild carrot, you're eating hemlock, and now you're dead. Be very careful when you're writing that if you want to have an example of, please, newbie versus skilled woodsman, that is a great example. Also, though, if you're writing someone who's just going about their day-to-day lives, make that point. Like, I checked for this sign because if you mix these up, you die. And that's the kind of thing that anybody who has lived in the woods will know well, that if you mix these plants up, and there's a whole handful of plants that you really don't want to mix up, but they're particularly in the carrot family because the plants can range from Queen Anne's lace, which will make you throw up, to wild carrot, which is great, tastes amazing, to hemlock, which will kill you, to wild parsnip, which is also in that family, which, now this is interesting, will poison you topically. It poisons your skin with its sap, and it makes your skin photosensitive. So after you've gotten around wild parsnip, you break out in huge blisters that then pop into really nasty scar tissue. It's an awful plant. So if your character ever mixes it up, or if your character wants to play a trick on an idiot adversary who doesn't know the woods, Go dig that up. That'll be dinner. 5 minutes later, arg, I'm breaking out in blisters. And hey, it works. Valerie just said, if you're on an alien planet and have no choice but to forage, what's the probability you'll die before you find sustainable food sources? It really depends on what base pairs are being used for the main chemistry. So chlorophyll is the main component of a lot of our plants' respiratory activities, the way they're growing. Humans and pretty much all animal life on Earth digest chlorophyll quite well. But if we got to a planet where something else was used as the basis, and this is not actually possible, but let's say it was mercury and we didn't know ahead of time, you're done. So it could be anywhere from, yeah, I didn't get enough to eat, to that guy died. He tried one plant and he died. It really depends on how hard you want to make it for your characters. But if you're a good example, if you're looking at a situation like that, is to look into what happened in Australia when the European convicts were basically dumped out there. How did they figure out where food was? And they did have a pretty high death rate. I think it was in the first year, it's like, I need to double check my details here, but it was like 20%. But the other 80% figured out you could eat this, you could eat that, you could eat the other thing. And that's basically by watching the 20% who didn't make it. So there's a lot to play with there. It really depends on, if you want to make an example of your first landing team, have them bite into something and die straight off. And that's how you learn that you can't digest that. If you want them to survive, I would say watch out for anything that makes your tongue tingle. Watch out for anything bitter. Watch out for anything sour. There are plenty of sour and bitter things that we can digest that are good for us. But if you bite into it and it tastes like you want to spit it out right away, do that. That's your innate animal level warning system telling you probably a bad idea, stop. But even more dangerous is if your tongue tingles, that means there are one of a whole handful of nerve agents in there. And I don't mean nerve agent like a toxin, like a nerve gas. I mean, it is active on the nervous system. So it's telling your brain something it can't translate. And so it's just going, must tingle, interesting. Spit that out right away and wash your mouth out, because it's affecting your nervous system, and that is death. The other thing you want to watch out for is a strange sensation of heat. Yes, I know we love chili peppers, but usually that's a warning of pain right around the corner. So let's see. Valerie continues. I was kind of more worried about accidentally eating hemlock. Is it safer to eat animals? Again, if you're working with an alien environment, it really depends on what is used as the basis for their base pairs. For an example of that, I would look up Catherine Valenti's book, Space Opera. That's C-A-T-H, let me just type it, that'll be faster. So Catherine Valenti makes a great point. It's a very silly book. It has a very good point. Like, how many base pairs does your DNA have? Because I think if it has more than 6, you have to sign a waiver, the bartender says at one point. You really have to ask yourself a lot deeper questions than just, I'm here, is that edible? You have to ask, what's the chemistry basis for this planet? So our chemistry basis is carbon, nitrogen, and plant base is in chlorophyll. Animal base is in deoxy DNA. I'm not going to try to say it all. You know, those are our bases. So everything can digest essentially everything else on this planet, with obvious caveats like don't eat pufferfish because it's overlaid its basis with toxins. But if you can't even digest the base pairs of the proteins being used in the animal meat, you have a whole bigger problem. That said, if it's simply, if you're going at the level of being dropped into something like a country you've never seen before, so whole different system of food, I would say a 20% chance you die straight off, 50% chance you're hungry for a few days and then you figure out something edible, and 20% chance you're totally fine and you get lucky, you find jackfruit right off, or you find rowan berries straight off, or you find something straight off. It also depends on the seasons you decide to design in your world, because if they drop into the howling northern winter of that planet, good luck, because the only thing edible is the bark on the trees and the lemmings if you can catch them under the snow, and the mice, and everything else is either asleep or has bigger claws than you. So let me write down Catherine Valenti's name. She does several really cool things. The other thing that I would recommend looking into is Alia Godard's Emaster and the Detective. It is an entire book about a dynamic duo, but it has a lot of focus on plants and especially tea making and how these teas are used to change the human mind to make it more perceptive and more able to handle space travel. And it's a really fun exploration of what genetic modification and ancient arts of tea making can do when they're combined. So it can get you thinking in that direction. I want to give another shout out to good examples. So Diane Mott Davidson writes the Goldie series, and she has a book that includes hemlock as a poison. Well, her main character figures out that she's been poisoned with hemlock. So she dashes over to the espresso stand of her friend and begs for the strongest espresso she can get, and then just starts chugging espresso. If you ever are poisoned with hemlock, the best thing you can do until somebody arrives who can pump your stomach or get you to the doctor is drink a ton of the strongest coffee you can get, because the caffeine can counteract the atropine in hemlock. So if you ever want to play with that, if you ever want to play with, you know, go back in time and save Socrates or anything like that, yeah, really strong black coffee is the defense against atropine. So any of the nightshade family, any of the hemlocks can be fought with good black coffee, really, really, really strong. Danuta asked, what's the Valenti's book? It's Catherine Valenti. Let me take the rest of that. Oh, thanks, Kristen. And I like Catherine Valenti's work because she really stresses what it looks like when you're working with truly non-human systems. And she's as non-human as you can get when you are still able to communicate in any viable way. But I loved the fact that the bartender was like, how many base pairs are in your DNA? Can I see some ID here? That's the kind of detail we want to work in when we're talking about this kind of stuff. Is there a good reason to use poison in a helpful way? Oh, yes. Oh boy, the history of medicine in general is How much of this poison is good for you and how much is bad for you? That's pretty much our history. Poppy juice is a great example. Really fine or really useful for you if you're in pain. Gonna kill you or turn off your breathing if you use too much. So we're up to 10 minutes. So I'm gonna go through kind of the history of poisons, and then I'll take another 2 questions, I think. And then if folks will just post their links so everybody can get to know everybody else's work, and I'll post mine. That'd be a great way to close things out. And I will draw up a list of all the books that I talked about today and send them to Monique, who will send them out to all of you guys. So let's see, poisons. All of our medicines are poisons if you use them wrong or overuse them. My favorite example is the plant that used to be the symbol for all pharmacology, which was foxglove. Now, foxglove is a really pretty purple flower. I'm going to find a picture in the Magic and Medicine of Plants. And this used to be a picture that was hung up outside of apothecary houses to say there is an apothecary who later was a pharmacist in here. It was one of their favorite symbols because it is an art form to figure out how much digitalis, which is derived from the foxglove plant, to give somebody to stop their heart from having problems, and how much will stop their heart, period, aka kill them. So the foxglove was discovered because a doctor had told a patient, get your issues in order, you're gonna die soon. And he was shocked when a little bit later, he saw his patient looking great, walking around. He's like, how'd you live? And the guy said, you told me I was gonna die. So I went to the old witch up the hill and she gave me tea and now I'm alive. So there. And so the doctor went to the old lady up the hill. And it turned out that the old lady up the hill had a tea that was mainly foxglove leaves. This is the foxglove plant. It's really pretty purple flower. Sorry, still trying to figure out how to get back to. And if you get the dose just right, it encourages the heart to beat more strongly and removes edema, which is fluid retention around the heart. But if you get it wrong, the heart races and races and races until it breaks down. You have a heart attack. And that dose is so sensitive between I feel better and I'm dead. So there are lots of uses for technically poisonous plants. America has a system where we label our drugs very specifically, all the way from Schedule 1 drug, which specifically means no medical use, high chance of abuse, all the way down to, I forget what the schedule is, but over-the-counter stuff. And even over-the-counter stuff can hurt you if you're not careful. Willow bark, for example, it's something you'd give a kid for aches and pains, growing pains even, toothache. But if you overdo it, it ruins your stomach lining. And you'd have to pretty heavily overdo it. And I'd be surprised if someone overdid it to that point because willow bark tea is awful, tastes awful. But if you're in a lot of pain and you're drinking willow bark tea every day, you're going to be in a whole new kind of pain in another 2 months because that willow bark is going to destroy your stomach lining. And that's what Tylenol will do too, because it's based in salicylic acid, which is what we got out of willow bark. So yeah, that kind of runs down the poison question. And Jessica, if you want to make any specific requests on that, feel free. Agatha Christie. Now, many problematic things in that work Don't get me wrong. But she was the artist of, oh, the physician's daughter had a bottle of laudanum on her and it just slipped. Or, oh, well, this little bit of poison got mixed in with this little bit of something. And so if you ever want to get really interested, get into that. Some other really fun things in terms of interesting, noxious chemicals are a lot of our decorative plants are actually poisonous. So the rhododendron, which if you live in an area where that grows, that's fairly poisonous. The digitalis that everybody likes to plant, a lot of people will plant Lenten rose. It was originally called hellebore, which tells you a bit more than Lenten rose, which is what we sell it under. So anybody who's worked in a garden knows to wear their gloves around a lot of plants. So any character who's worked in a garden will at least have a passing knowledge of that's poisonous. And if they don't have a passing knowledge, then they haven't been paying attention. So if you want a character who is mildly knowledgeable about what can kill someone, start with your gardeners. Even daffodil bulbs. If you mix up your daffodils and your onions, it doesn't kill you as fast or as efficiently or as accurately, but you're going to have the night from hell. You're going to wish you died because it messes with the digestive system and the bowels. So we've got about 4 minutes left, and I just wanted to make one last point. In a lot of communities, the healing folks are the folks who would not get traditionally married. So if you want a place for your gender non-conforming character, the healers are always the best. If you want a place where nobody is going to question, well, okay, there will always be a jerk who will question you. But traditionally, in a lot of indigenous societies across the world, the folks who were born not fitting the usual mold became healers, became wise folk, became knowledge keepers. And that was where they fit in the society. So if you want your gender non-conforming character or your LGBT character of any stripe to have status in the community, a great place to put them is as the herb person or the healer or the wise person, because many communities, I'm going to apologize if this comes out badly ahead of time, but many communities would say, okay, if you're not going to have kids, if you're not going to have if you're not going to have the general works in the field or works in the house position, we could really use a healer. So come over here, we need you, because indigenous communities around the world didn't have time for a lot of, how do I say this? Well, they needed every hand on board. So they found a way for everyone to be useful. And yes, we can all think of terrible examples, but most communities were like, okay, you don't like that or that or that? Here, this fits you. And many people took pride in that around the world and throughout time. Like, I don't want kids. I like other girls, or I'm a guy who likes other guys. I don't want to deal with all this other stuff. So I'm going to take care of the community a different way. So yeah, I would recommend that for any time you want to make sure your characters are getting respect and status while still showing very clearly their LGBT identity. Kristen is making a really interesting point about the Georgian era. It looks like we need to wrap up, so thank you everyone, and I will send out a big piece for everybody. So everybody take care of yourselves and go out and have some fun in the gardens as soon as it warms up. Take care.